Thank you, Sam. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As promised, we're going to talk about the Bank Secrecy Act, your anti-money laundering program, focusing specifically on recent developments and common errors. Your handouts are threefold. Number one, you have a manual that I use in support of a full-day BSA seminar. Obviously, we're not going to cover a 100-page manual in a 2-hour session. We give you the manual so you'll have a new resource to start the new year with. And I will go from page to page in several places pointing things out in that manual that I would specifically want to draw to your attention. You also have two other resources. Now, it isn't essential that you print all these out necessarily, assuming you have the ability to look at them during the presentation. But in any case, the other two resources are the CTR FAQs from FinCEN and the SAR FAQs from the same source. Notice that those are both Word documents. In essence, the documents on the FinCEN website did not print in a reasonable fashion, so I copied and pasted them into a Word document. But I want to point it out just to emphasize these are not resources that I created. These are official FinCEN resources. They are as valid for your purposes as the instructions to either of those two reports would be. I will be referring to those during the presentation as well. To sort of summarize the presentation, what we want to do is to look at the recent changes that have been made, added or eliminated. Now, frankly, with BSA, they rarely eliminate anything, but theoretically, if they had taken something away from your responsibilities, I would mention it to you. But also I want to talk about areas where questions on compliance persist. Those of you who use the threads on Bankers Online, hopefully you're familiar with the area where we talk about Bank Secrecy Act compliance. As far as I'm concerned, when I talk about persistent questions, I'm talking about questions that are posted in the threads and also questions that are posed to me by seminar attendees. I also want to mention some major enforcement actions, but frankly, I've got enough to talk about without dwelling on those. And that information, I think, is readily available to everyone. If you do a Google search on J.P. Morgan News, you're going to find out about the most recent enforcement action involving that organization. And there'll be a lot of detail there. So I'm going to shy away from pontificating about those particular things. One thing I do want to point out to you, if you're involved in compliance in your institution, your responsibility in connection with BSA, AML responsibilities, they're going to make the news a lot more than your compliance officers who are in charge of consumer compliance issues. We have no shortage of attention being paid to the topics that we are interested in. On this slide that's up right now, it talks about the Silk Road, which was essentially an underground website that sold a number of things. Just a quote from one article, 70% of the things listed there were drugs that are considered contraband in most jurisdictions. The site's terms of service prohibited the sale of anything that's purpose was to harm or defraud. But again, it was clearly devoted to the sale of illegal products and in some cases illegal services. And that impacts financial institutions. Obviously, when people are buying and selling contraband, they have to have some method of payment, which is a pretty decent segue to the next slide, or to the next image on that slide, which talks about bitcoins, the virtual currency. The Silk Road dealt a great deal in bitcoins. That was the medium of exchange for the Silk Road website. Bankers are still kind of scratching their heads trying to figure out what real impact that bitcoins has on their operations. FinCEN has issued some guidance. We will talk about it very late in the program, but in essence, I'd say at this stage of the game, what you need to know is, do any of your customers accept bitcoins as a medium of payment? That would be incorporated perhaps in your due diligence efforts. Obviously, the most recent slide, the enforcement action that I just mentioned, dealt with J.P. Morgan, and again, a Google search will get you thousands of hits on that particular point. But just to focus on the essence, J.P. Morgan Bank, Madoff, in his operations, as did other financial institutions, J.P. Morgan's been selected for a enforcement action, basically under the heading of their failure to file suspicious activity reports. Clearly, regulators have taken an interesting view on the failure to file SARs and indicating that such failures harm the public, and use this as an example of that. Clearly, any financial institution that is used by a bad actor and has not filed SARs on that activity may be in the future picking up some of the blame for that bad actor's activity, as if the filing of a SAR would have caused law enforcement to put an end to that activity. It's a really fairly theoretical conclusion, but anyway, it does impact the way that we look at things. Also on the next slide, a recent article about banks and marijuana sales. There are 2 states in the United States where it is legal to use marijuana for recreational purposes. It's fine that state law allows that activity, but federal law doesn't allow that activity. So in states where medical marijuana is legal, which is, if I remember correctly, approximately 17 states, the banks in those states, in addition to the states where marijuana is legal for recreational purposes, have to make a decision. Are we going to bank these customers? Again, being legal under state law does not address the issue as to whether or not they're legal under federal law. One thing is not going to be counted as a defense to the other. So banks in several states have some difficult decisions to face on this particular topic. There is one release mentioned in the second image on that screen that talks about a small-town bank president, small bank for that matter, approximately $45 million, where the president was prosecuted for the bank's failure to establish and conduct a Bank Secrecy Act compliance program, as well as the bank's failure to file a SAR in a very specific fact situation. Of all the things we're talking about right now, I think that's the one that may be of the greatest interest to community financial institutions. It's hard for us to recognize or identify with millions or billions of dollars in penalties. And it is, however, I think easy for everyone to identify with the fact that the CEO of a small-town institution was prosecuted for BSA violations. And the last one is an article, a very recent article, as a matter of fact, from Wall Street Journal, indicating that the U.S. Department of Justice intends to focus more heavily on its enforcement actions against financial institutions. Now, obviously, we're talking criminal enforcement actions here, not a fine or an order from FinCEN, but from the U.S. Department of Justice. That should be enough, I think, perhaps to get everyone's attention. But the overall point I want to make right here, there's a lot of big picture responsibilities attached to your institution's compliance with the Bank Secrecy Act. In this presentation, we're going to focus a lot more, I think, on nuts and bolts today, because there are some very basic things that you need to make sure you have incorporated into your efforts. But we are a part of the rest of the world on this issue, and we've got to, again, stay abreast of the topics that come up. In terms of your resources, what you have in front of you at your fingertips, I'm going to just review that quickly. In terms of the handout, just go to page 3 in the manual that you have. It talks about your resources on the Internet. There on page 3, it shows you the banner and the URL for the FinCEN website. I'll just remind you that FinCEN is the administrator of the Bank Secrecy Act. They are not a law enforcement agency. They are the administrator of the Bank Secrecy Act. They are a bureau within the Department of the Treasury. But what they say about BSA compliance reflects the final rule on BSA compliance. So their resource, their primary resource would be that.